Okay, today I have the pleasure of talking to Leafcutter John. I have gotten a lot of requests for having John on the podcast. He is pretty well known anyway, but then just recently he was a guest at Ableton's Loop event, and I got like a half a dozen immediate requests saying, "Oh, you ought to talk to Leafcutter John." So I reached out to him, and he was nice enough to say yes. And so with that, we say hi to Leafcutter John. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm really good. How are you, Darren?
I'm doing great. I was a little late to this because I've been doing some hellacious video editing, but now I get a chance to talk to a good guy, so I think that's going to make my day a lot better.
I hope so.
So why don't we start off by having you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your work and some of the things you've been doing recently.
Yeah, I'm a musician and producer. I started off as a visual artist. Graduated in '98 and moved to London in the UK. I tried to be a performance artist for about a year, and then in fact that was not really working out. I had this old computer which I had bought to do my dissertation, and it made sort of rudimentary kind of bleeps and noises, and I think you could sample as well. And I got really into that, and just as a hobby, I was really fascinated by the possibilities of it, and sort of developed a body of experiments which I played to a friend of mine, and he immediately showed me a load of records from Warp and Planet Mu that were in a similar kind of world, and it's stuff I'd never heard before. So that's what got me going, really. My friend introducing me to that world, and I was lucky enough to get signed to Planet Mu, which got me going, really. So that was the start. That was like '99, and over the 15, 16 years, 17 years actually between now and then, I've been making albums, and I've been playing with a jazz band called Polar Bear, and really my main interest is just exploring sound and trying to perform in a way which is not sort of stuck behind or tied to the laptop. So that's a little bit about me, and my latest project is a record called it's called Resurrection. My girlfriend's telling me it's called Resurrection, and it came out on vinyl on Desire Path Records, which is an American label, a couple of months ago, and it's on a nice it's on nice clear blue and green vinyl. So that's me.
Well, that's cool. That's a great introduction. So you started as a visual artist. You are now doing things that you say are trying to transcend even the laptop, which sounds like a pretty aggressive path, even though it happened over a number of years. I'm first of all a little bit curious about when you talk about trying to go beyond the laptop. What exactly are you talking about there?
What I mean by that is not to be tied to it in performance, really. I like what you can do with the laptop, and it's been a good companion for me in both composition and performance. And of course, when I started, it wasn't a laptop because they didn't exist.
Right.
So, they were certainly beyond my means. So what I mean is more for performance is that I don't want to be stuck behind a laptop, basically. That's
Right.
basically.
So what do you use to mitigate that? What tools do you use to get away from the laptop?
Well, I do a lot of sound recording, which is in the studio. That gets me away, and that gets me physically manipulating objects
Right.
and other machines that are not the laptop. And then for performance, I developed this thing called a light interface, which is 16 light sensors. The way that it works is that it basically controls different max patches, and it might be playing a track, or it might be improvising with kind of different types of sounds, and it allows me to gesturally control a performance, and it's really fun.
I'm really curious because when I look at your work, it's an amazing there's an amazing breadth of work there, both musically, but then also sort of in kind of a DIY space, right? And even here you talk about it. There's sort of like a builder maker kind of aspect to what you do. I'm curious about your background. I'm curious about how you grew up and the things you learned that helped you become the artist that you are now.
My mum and dad were teachers. My dad was an art teacher. My mum was she taught kids with special needs. Actually, is what they might be called now. So very supportive parents, and in terms of like emotional support, yeah, I thought I was going to be an artist. I went to art school. I was always fairly relaxed about the kind of art that I wanted to make. So it might have been painting, or it could have been performance or installation. I didn't. I've always been really had that flexibility, and I guess a kind of faith that I could do an idea using the right tools or using the right medium. So I've never really. I feel like I never really aimed for anything in particular, like as a final goal. Like I never wanted to make an album, or I never wanted to have an exhibition or that stuff. But when it comes, I feel like by not grasping for it, I feel like those things have just come to me in a slightly more organic way. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, and maybe that's a difference in almost a generational difference or something, because it seems like I right now teach at an art school, but it wasn't that long ago that I was an art student. And one of the things I know from that time period is that the current group of people that is going through art school have a tendency to be really goal focused, and really, they try and identify, how am I going to, work? How am I going to get all these things happening? It's really interesting to hear that you kind of focused on allowing serendipity to kind of kind of find a path for you.
That's one of the elements of it. But I also work really hard. I think there's no substitute for working hard
Right.
and developing yourself. Yeah, I know what you mean. I've met some younger performers, maybe 10 years younger than me, doing festivals and things. And their work's often really focused, and they're really focused individuals. And it's a totally valid way of being. But yeah, it's not something that sort of I feel a bit jealous of it sometimes because they seem to know where they're going.
Oh yeah, I hear that. That's true. I am ancient by most artists' rules, and I still feel like I'm grasping at trying to find a direction. So there's that. Now I'm curious about the transition from you gave us just a little glimpse of the transition from doing visual art and attempting to be a performance artist to becoming a musician. You said you kind of did some stuff, put it on tape, and this friend of yours introduced you to similar things from some of these labels. What drew you in that direction? And what was, I mean, give us an idea how in 1998, 1999, what making music for an artist would look like. Because I think some of the tools now are very relatable to artists of different ilks, but I think at the time that wasn't really the case.
For the artist that my friend was listening to, and then later I was listening to, it was like there were Atari STs
Mm-hmm.
doing MIDI sequencing. There was Luke Vibert with his 303s and that kind of sound. Aphex Twin had like quite a lot of equipment by that time. And what I was doing was I had one program that could convolve two sounds together, and I got really obsessed with that. It was called Hog, and it ran on a PC, and it really like just I just would spend days just combining different field recordings together, and maybe thinking, if I could record this kitchen thing and combine it with this water sound, what would that sound like? Got really like just totally fascinated basically by the possibilities of that. And then I was also making these long string instruments as well, which have a kind of tie into the fine art world. So I was just combining a load of stuff, basically, whatever interested me. And then the compositions themselves were fairly carefully edited together.
Mm-hmm.
I think I bought the first sort of consumer version of Pro Tools, which was like a Digi 001,
Oh yeah.
which at some point I got rid of my PC and I got a Mac Tower. And I don't really remember when that was. That's probably sometime around the first album, which was 2000.
Interesting. So, I mean, one of the things I think people would identify you with is sort of this sample manipulation. Did you ever use like sampling instruments, or was it always sort of like recording and then editing?
As in, what, sampling real instruments? Is that what you're
No,
talking about?
no, I'm talking about did you use a sampler device ever, or were you always really just recording and then manipulating those recordings?
I used to like a hardware sampler.
Yeah, like an old Akai sampler or something like that. Did you ever use any of those tools?
Yeah, there was a time when Emu were discounting their samplers, so it was either Akai or Emu basically.
Okay.
And I got this one with a really nice filter board in it, so it had these analog filters in it. I used to use, completely fill the memory up with tiny little sounds of whatever, you know.
Right.
And it wasn't a very big memory as well. It was really tiny, so I had a lot of very tiny sounds, very short little sounds. And then I do much longer recordings, manipulating objects basically, and combine those two things together.
Okay, that makes sense then. Now, what for you when you started when all of a sudden you kind of discovered these labels that were sort of doing similar stuff for you? That time frame, the late 90s, the early 2000s, there was a lot of excitement about what's happening. I think a lot of a lot of technology was changing, and it really swung the door open to a lot of different kinds and new ways of doing sound processing. But also, there were all these artists, like you mentioned, like Luke and Aphex Twin and some of these other people coming on the scene. When you started listening to that stuff, how did it influence you?
Well, it's a bit intimidating when you start listening to the best electronic music when they've had like maybe 10 years head start on you.
Yeah, sure.
At that time, Aphex was doing really amazing stuff, and Square Pusher 2, and there were a couple of Autechre releases that were just incredible at that around that period. It was definitely a thing that people were into at that time. There were lots of festivals, and I never really quite fitted into that, but it definitely did influence me. I mean, I have my little theory on why each one of those people is good.
Yeah. I mean, sure. I'm a big Autechre fan, especially from that time period as well. What do you think makes them, for example, special? I just kind of want to like pick your brain a little bit.
what I The only thing I listen to of theirs is, I think it's called EP 7.1 and EP 7.2.
Hmm.
I get a little bit obsessed with certain albums, and they become, I don't have a huge amount of stuff I listen to, but that's one of the couple of records that I listen to. And what I like about their stuff is it's it's really stubborn, and and they're just doing their process,
Right.
and you get the feeling it's part of something that was hours and hours long, and they've trimmed it down and made it succinct, and they're really good at doing that.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a great way to frame them and frame their work. And it also, I mean, it's interesting to me to hear you talk about kind of becoming obsessed with albums. I think that that's something that often happens with musicians is that you end up sort of like making these markers out of specific artists and specific work that they've done that sort of represent a place and a time and an influence that it may not be completely audible in what you do, but it becomes sort of like one of your almost emotional marker points in time.
For me, something like Autechre, that's a kind of avenue that I don't think there's any point me going down that
Right,
that that road, because they've ticked that one off.
right,
But there's something really, I mean, on a zooming out from specific tracks, there's something really great about the balance between mechanization and emotion, which is present in their music, which is pretty fascinating.
right.
It's always something that I think is important to have in my music is this kind of sense of emotional play, pushing and pulling them. So I think I do it in a different way than Ortega at that period, but it's pretty, yeah. I think it's beautiful music.
Right. Well, you were just walking down a path I was going to take too, which is it seems like that they take these processes and stuff like this, but it ends up turning, it ends up having a voice and almost an organic nature, even when some of these processes aren't very organic. I would say you do a different thing, but you have a similar result, which is that the end result seems really organic and it seems really personal and it seems to be a peculiar and individual voice. What would you attribute that to in your own work?
My voice?
Yeah. I mean, do you think it's because of some of your background? Do you think it's more because of the things that you're drawn to as source material? Or do you think it's related to just your interest in obsessive editing?
Well, I'm not interested anymore in obsessive editing. It's something that I could do when I was in my 20s and early 30s, but it's not something that I can be bothered with anymore, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty interested in a live gesture right now. But I think the biggest thing that influences what I sound like in any period is what I'm fascinated by during that period. And the working process is always based around something that I'm fascinated with. Because then it doesn't feel like work anymore if you're totally, having a great time finding out about something new.
That's a good point. That's great. Now, that also kind of that discussion kind of talks more to the point of your performance type work or your actual performance work. So you apparently lit up the place at the Ableton Loop thing. I wasn't able to go, but it sounded like that was like a lot of people were really inspired and pretty blown away by what you did there.
Well, that was nice to be invited to go. It's good to meet some of the names and from my dealings with cycling over the last 10 or 15 years.
Right. Well, and conversely, a lot of them were very excited to meet you too. So it was a good opportunity there. Let's talk a little bit about performance and particularly something that I'm obsessed with. When I talk to people who are adept at both performance but also have a body of recorded work, I get a little obsessed about one thing. For me, I enjoy doing performance. I have a hell of a time putting a recording together because for some reason a performance is I can set up what I'm going to do. I get in front of people, I kind of blow it out against the back wall, and then I shake everyone's hand, and whatever it was, and whatever these people will take away from it, they take away from it, and that's great. When I try and do a recording, all I seem to be able to obsess about is, Jesus, why did I do that one thing? Oh my goodness, this doesn't sound like anything like what I do now. It's horrible. And I'm curious about how someone like you who really has a strong performative angle, how you allow yourself to even do a recording.
I struggle with some of those things as well, Darwin, so it's not, you're not alone.
Okay, well, that's good.
Well, I could talk a little bit about this band, Polar Bear, which I've been part of for about, over 10 years now, and we've recorded, I think, 5 or 6 albums together. It usually works in the same way. The album's written by the drummer, and we rehearse a bit, and we might play it live, and then we just go in a studio and record it as a band. It usually takes between 2 and 5 days, and then, someone edits it, usually not me, so I don't know, maybe I've been influenced a little bit by that. I don't know. It is really difficult when you get overly precious about what you're putting down,
Right.
and because of the way that if you're recording on your own, things build up layer by layer. It's really easy to be disheartened by the first few layers. And for me, I always try and remember that it's about one layer contextualizing another, and and the possibility of one layer completely transforming what went before it, or putting it into the right context. So I try and just not to judge it before it's before it's before it's time.
Sure.
And also I find it's really helpful if I have a little story in my mind, or a little an idea of what the track is about, or something that means that I don't obsess about getting the perfect tin pan sound or something.
Right, right. That's actually a good point. If one recording that I worked on where I was more of a producer than the artist, but yeah, I was just given a bunch of material and it was like, well, try and develop something with this. And I was struggling to find an anchor, and so I just decided, for some reason, I like tripped over something on the television or something. I was like, well, I'm going to do something about the 12 disciples of Christ out of this, right? Well, there was nothing about the source material that represented that, but now all of a sudden I had a story, and I could go and I could Google, this one was like a weirdo tax guy or whatever, and I could make up little stories out of each of their lives. And as ridiculous as that sounded, it really allowed me to quickly put something together and not obsess about the tiny details.
Yeah, I think sounds like sometimes the sort of thing you need to do. And is it when I work as a producer, then that's the kind of thing I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sense of what they're doing.
Right.
Because sometimes even an artist can be incredible, but they sometimes it's hard for them to maybe communicate that with everyone else in the band, or it just needs something to so it means something to everybody basically. And if you're on your own, you're doing the producer role and you're doing the composer role sort of simultaneously. It's not an easy thing.
Yeah, I was
to,
just going to ask about that. Since you very formally, in some cases, perform the producer role, when it comes to your own music, do you do you bring in other people to sort of like fulfill some roles so that you don't have to obsess about them, or do you kind of lock yourself in a room and go at
I try each approach until it stops working, and then I change.
it? Okay.
Um, it usually What I find is that if someone is if someone at a label is kind of waiting for something, then I'm more inclined to make something.
Right.
Um, and the last record only came about really because the Michael at Desire Path expressed an interest really in releasing something, and then just was very patient for 2 years while I put something together, basically. But that can go really wrong. Before that, there was an album that I was working on for another Michael. It was the. Do you know Michael Girard?
Um,
He's in a band called the Swans.
oh yeah. Okay. Sure. I know of him. I don't know him personally.
Mm. He's a really interesting guy, and he wrote to me after hearing an album called The Forest and the Sea, which was like a kind of combination of electroacoustic music and kind of a folk-ish thing.
Right.
And he really liked it, and he sort of said, "Oh, I'd like to release something. Whatever you do, I'd be into listening to and releasing maybe." And I got kind of I started listening to some other people on his label, and I got really overly influenced by the stuff I was listening to, and my music completely changed. And I made a load of music and sent it to him, and he was kind of into it. And then after about a year, I felt, God, this is not me at all. And I said,
No.
we can't do this.
Oh no.
Yeah, so I've got like a couple of albums worth of songs which I cringe every time they appear.
Yeah. You know what though? I think that happens more often than people even want to suggest. And sometimes not, again, I hate using my own self, but your stories are really ringing bells for me here. I recently did a festival, and They asked me to do a live performance, kind of a live performance in combination with doing some DJing. So I was doing some live work, and then I would switch over to another artist's work. And in order to make it so that there was kind of a thread through it, I was using all these artists that are on the Raster Noton label.
Mm-hmm.
And like Aldo Nova, I'm obsessed with, and some of these other folks. But it was weird because as I was putting together those tracks, that started influencing so much that everything I made sounded like it was coming right off of those records. And I listened back to the recording I made of the performance, and I was like, oh my God, I maybe listened to that a little too much.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's when there's an aesthetic which is so strong like that Rasta stuff, or maybe like Ortega has a pretty strong aesthetic, and some of the Aphex stuff too. Like, he seems to have a couple of aesthetics that he operates within. It can be daunting, I guess, to if you approach it like how am I gonna make this completely unique aesthetic? Then that's probably the wrong way. It's the most intimidating way of going at it. I think most stuff comes from somewhere, and if you're really good, then you just steal it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we call that synthesizing in art, right? You synthesize it into your work. You mentioned there a little bit about some of the tie-ins that you have where you seem to be combining electroacoustic, almost like classical electroacoustic and computer music with sort of a real folk influences. What is it about the folk thing that resonates with you?
Well, maybe I can start that by talking about something electroacoustic music. Actually, when I was on Planet Mu, I met up with Mike, this guy Mike Paradinas, who's the guy from Planet Mu Records, and he had this mini disc that he was listening to. We all had mini disc players in that day,
Right.
And I loved them because you could record onto them. And he had this mini disc that Aphex Twin had given him, and it was absolutely mind blowing. And I listened to it. I remember we were on a tube, and I listened to like 1.5 tracks, and I thought, this is amazing. I'm going to keep this. And he wouldn't let me. He wouldn't let me keep it. So I wrote down what it was, and then I thought, right, I'm going to buy this, and it was out of print, and I had to go to this place in Elephant and Castle to try and buy it, and it wasn't there. And then I put a message on I think some message board, and some guy just sent me a copy of it in the mail, and it was Bernard Parmigiani's De Natura Sanorum, which is like kind of, I think it's from '76, and it's to me it's like it's telling me a story. It's very natural, and it's very kind of it's just incredible piece of music. And to me, it just makes me want to sing. So that's like where the folky thing comes from. Just telling a story. I think that's what interests me about folk music, is the kind of narrative element of it. And that album, the Parmigiani album, sort of awoke something which made me feel like singing. So
I'm not familiar with this work. What is it? Is it?
I think it's a piece with limited source material. So it's basically made with tape, I think, as far as I can work out, and it's got a sine wave generator, and it's got a wine glass, and it's got some kind of orchestral instrumentation as well, but they're all processed really heavily. And it's just, yeah, I mean, you need someone like Keith Fullerton Whitman to tell you how more about that, how it's made. But I'm sure he would know.
I'm sure he would, yeah.
But for me, it's I don't really want to know how it's made, but it's kind of, it sounds like it's a tape piece, and it's got that kind of overdriven kind of quality to it. You should check it out. It's a pretty remarkable record.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I will have to track that down. So the sound of that, and sort of like the desire to make you sing, and its ability to tell a story to you, that speaks to folk music for you. How did you then extend it to start using like folk instruments and doing things that were more a direct tie to folk music. How did that come about? I mean, did you have some background that was like really full of folk music, or was it something that you searched out?
To be honest, I never really directly investigated it, but things kept happening that were bringing me in contact with folk musicians.
I see.
Like I made an electroacoustic piece out of a mandolin that I had in my studio, and I always wanted to sing on the records. So like on my first record, there's singing at the end of it, but I don't think anyone ever made it to the end of the record, so no one ever heard it. Uh, so I think there's singing on all of them actually. But yeah, it's something that I like doing, and yeah, I like it when electronic people sing. I think
Right.
it's
Well, it's interesting because for me, the some of the things that like Laurie Spiegel did and stuff like that sort of knotted together electroacoustic and computer music with folk stuff, but it was mostly doing folk-like tunes or melodies or whatever with those instruments. And it's kind of interesting to imagine a different take on that, which is to say, let's use the instruments and let's use voice. I mean, voice, I think one of the reasons people actually get into electronic music is because they hate the sound of their voice, right? So it's kind of interesting to think of drawing the voice into that kind of music.
yeah, it's vocals have a funny. I think it's interesting to look at instrumental music and stuff where the voice features, but in a very minimal way, and what happens when the voice appears. Like, where does that pull the ear? And it always, as soon as a voice comes, you're glued to it.
Right.
I don't remember much about my dad's Mike Oldfield album, but I do remember that a voice comes in, announces the instruments. So he comes. I think he appears and says mandolin, and then the mandolin comes in, and he says tubular bells, and it plays that
Hmm.
the theme. And Kraftwerk, had their own way of approaching the voice.
Well, and
Yeah, and
it's interesting because if you think about like the most memorable electronic music tunes, they all have like melodic bits, or for the most part, they have melodic bits that are almost vocal, or you could almost sing them, right?
some of it, yeah. What just out of interest, what is the most memorable electronic tune?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I was thinking of something of like Halcyon and On, or some of the old orbital things. To me, are the ones that I always thought that their melodic things were almost vocal lines that they just use a synthesizer instead.
Yeah, yeah. Wasn't the first piece of electronic music that Daisy song? Was that the first thing played by an electronic
Oh
synth?
yeah, the first thing that they had a computer
Yeah.
produce was Daisy, right? And
Which,
they ended up kind of making a joke of that in 2001: Space Odyssey.
yeah, when it all goes
When
wrong.
it all goes wrong, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and is it? I mean, there's for me. That's. I think part of it is a kind of. I like the idea of singing. Like, I quite like the idea of being up there singing. There's
Right.
something. There's something that connects you with the audience that you can't do in any other way.
I think you're right about that, and I also think in terms of just I think there's an emotional connection. There's psychological and even physiological things that have us respond to human voice, in a very visceral and strong way, and that's got to exist in music as well as in daily life.
I totally agree with you. I think and it makes me think about what I've been doing with my light interface, connecting the physical action with the reproduction of sound, which is basically what most acoustic instruments do.
Right.
But you do it in an electric context, an electronic music context, and it blows people's brains a bit. Like
Hmm.
if I play in a small place where the audience is close and they can see what's going on and I can hear them, I'll do my first few strokes with the lights, and like 9 times out of 10, someone says, "Whoa, that's magic."
Right. I haven't seen this. Is there video on you performing with this somewhere?
Yeah, there is. There's on my YouTube. I think it's if you search for light interface, then you'll see it's like a super responsive instant electroacoustic machine.
So do you have like light sensors where you break the light, or are you like shining a light at the light sensors? What
Yeah,
physically, how are you interacting with the sensors?
yeah, shining my bike lights and various other novelty lights at the sensors,
Oh,
and
okay.
I spent a week talking about different musical interfaces in various workshops in Germany recently. In fact, leading up to the Ableton thing,
Uh-huh.
there's something about the fact you can't control where the light goes all the time, which is a bit like when you play a guitar. You get resonances and you get sympathetic vibrations, which are really natural, and but kind of hard to model.
Right.
The light behaves in a similar way, and it's also unpredictable. So if the light guy suddenly turns up the lights, then he's playing then.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how do you deal with that when you're on a stage and not controlling the light environment? You just live with whatever the result is?
Yeah, you have to have a sense of humor.
Did you ever like get upset and just like throw your body over the top of the sensors just to make it all stop?
I never got upset because honestly, it's a lot of fun. And if the lighting guy forgets, then it's kind of hilarious because you can say, "Oh, well," you step away from it, and then he or she will realize what's going on.
Right, right.
But there's a bit in the show where people can shine their torches on it and their iPhones or their whatever they've got.
Yeah, I was going to say it probably becomes iPhone central at that point.
Yeah, and some people have got really kind of stroby ones, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's really fun.
Oh, that sounds like a blast. I just now looked and I realized that I've used up my allocated time for you, but or the time I asked to have from you. But I want to ask one more question because I think that this will be helpful for people. When you talk about your background, you don't talk about it being a heavily technological one, but you certainly do use a lot of technology, or at least hack together a lot of technology for the work that you do. What was the method by which you sort of approached technology? I mean, did you have was there something in your art training that prepared you for it, or did you just dive in and say I'm going to figure this stuff out? And I ask this because on one hand, you do Max MSP programming, and so you seem comfortable with the computer programming world, but also you really kind of have a background doing DIY type stuff, and you're hacking together light sensors and stuff, so there's sort of a circuitry bent to what you're doing too. How did you get comfortable with all this stuff? How did you approach it in a way that felt comfortable to you as an artist?
Back in '95, when went to art college, in the first couple of months they taught you how to stretch a canvas, how to make the frame, how to grind your own pigment, and that simple knowledge that you can make your own materials had a pretty profound effect. Because up until that point, I thought you bought a canvas in the size that you wanted,
Hmm.
and that you bought tubes of paint. But this idea that, well, looking at where that stuff comes from, like a lot of paint comes from different kinds of soil or different rocks, or underwater sea creatures or stuff like that. It's quite fascinating where pigment comes from, and I sort of carried that through. Really, think the what made me comfortable with making things was right back to when I was a kid, and I'd go to my grandparents' house, and there wasn't a huge amount to do, but there was this shed which was full of wood and nails and screws, and we'd generally make something. And I think that the idea of like getting your hands dirty and just building what you want is something that comes right from that back from that period, and it's reinforced through art school. And it just means you're not limited to what anyone else decides you should be working on or working with. And then the light interface uses an Arduino, which is brilliantly supported in the community, and it's like a really great example of open source, an open source project that has got a brilliant community and a very giving community around it. And basically, I just sat down as a novice and learned a little bit of code, adapted some example patches, and then sat down with the serial object and worked that out, and just accrued that knowledge on my own. Really, like, it's not difficult to do. You just need to dedicate a little bit of time.
That's a really interesting story and an interesting way of viewing that. I think we have a tendency to sort of disconnect stuff that uses electronics from the rest of the world, but that's a beautiful way to frame it, that you're working with your own material and you're learning how to build things. You're learning how to create your own material instead of just buying solutions. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's goes for the sort of sound world as well. So I think it's important that people continue to make instruments and experiment with different ways of using the sound that's already around us, and try and push things. Don't be afraid of. I mean, I think the biggest freeing thing that has ever happened is to realize that I'm never going to be any of the people that influence me, and having the kind of confidence just to let go of that and explore my fascinations, and then realize that that is what I am. The sounds that come out of that is my music, and I think that's the key thing. And it's just, I think it's sometimes difficult. I find it difficult to fully believe that sometimes, but when I'm in a good mood and things are working out, that's what it feels like.
Sure. John, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sort of like wander around concepts of influence and technologies and how to get work done. This is stuff that's always really fascinating to me anyway, and I appreciate you sort of like putting up with my stumbling questions.
No, they were good questions.
Yeah, cool. Well, so thank you so much, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk again soon. Maybe meet up at a festival or something and hang out.
That'd be great. I should look forward to that.
Indeed. I'll talk to you soon then. Goodbye.
Cheers.
Hey, I'm on the road. Just a quick note to say thanks a lot for listening. Thanks a lot to Leafcutter John for the interview. And I'll see you next week. Bye.